Good afternoon, everybody. So we're with Microsoft's detection and response team. Most of you probably know us as DART, is the name more formally known as. So today we're going to talk about NOBELIUM and the methodology we see with NOBELIUM. This is going to kind of cover a little bit of what we've seen across multiple customers. This isn't a single customer, this isn't a single instance, just collaboratively what we've seen over the past year or two. So we're going to kind of just talk about NOBELIUM's methodology. My name is Garrett Marsh, senior consultant with DART, and then
I'm Riley Childs. I'm a senior consultant with DART.
And I'm Johnathan Sykes. I'm a director for digital forensics on DART. I'm a manager. Awesome. All right, so the first thing we're going to get into is the NOBELIUM cycle, and this is a cycle of how we identify NOBELIUM accessing environments, what they do to the environments, the data they collect in environments because they are an espionage group, and the resource development they do post-collection. And a lot of this is a continuous cycle. What we initially see is access vectors, not so much initial access. It's very hard to attribute to NOBELIUM. As most folks know in the threat intelligence community, their tradecraft is very tight, meaning it makes it very hard for us to align actions to actors. But whenever we put the cycle together, traditionally towards the end of the attack, we're able to walk it back and identify the who of the 5 Ws. So we'll first start, and as we go through this PowerPoint, we'll talk through the vectors, the execution, the collection, and the resource development. So for entry vectors, one of the main entry vectors we see NOBELIUM doing is password sprays. And with the password sprays, they move into harvesting post that and use that harvesting aspect to then re-enter the environment, which is where you see the credential harvesting as well. We also see them re-enter environments post-compromise long times later, sometimes 6 months to a year later, with data that they've collected during that time, which is part of the resource development we'll get to. For the execution, a lot of things we see is harvesting. As you see in the middle of this screen of identities, their main TTP is getting identities, getting accounts, getting computer accounts. That's their persistent mechanism. They do embed malware, backdoors, persistent scheduled tasks, and items like that, but they really key into the identity aspect, and they use that as their persistent mechanism. CVE exploitation is something we see them do as well, using both novel and old CVE exploitations that we'll get into later in the brief. Token replay is something that most actors are doing across the board right now, and they're actually fairly good at it, grabbing sessions, cookies, and leveraging that to access other aspects of the environment. Collection is this actor's main MO, their main objective. They're trying to get environment architecture, trying to get diagrams for your environment, they're trying to get identities, they're trying to understand what your environment is and get a very good picture of what the attack surface is so they can then come back in stealthy ways and novel ways that we'll talk to here later to get additional data to collect. As a Russian-linked group performing espionage, this is their main objective. The interesting thing of all of that is we see this actor being very, very good with resource development. As they capture that data, we see them going back, planning things out, and coming back later and actually making that data actionable. And we'll talk to that a little bit throughout this brief as well.
So one of the things, part of the cycle here we talk about is the continuation of that cycle, is continuing their entry into the environments they're trying to gain access into, right? So they're trying both novel, common methods all the time. Kind of what Johnathan, what he talked about, right? This isn't your traditional threat actors where they're in there to snatch and grab, to cause havoc on you. This is purely espionage, right? So they're always trying to stay stealthy as they can. But part of that, right, they got to get that initial access. So our initial access usually is through targeted password sprays. A lot of the targeted password sprays we commonly see are from VPS providers. And usually what they'll do is get VPS providers or data centers within the same region of that organization, right? Customers in middle of Kansas, they're going to try to do a data center in the middle of Kansas, so it looks like normal activity coming to you, right? So it doesn't stick out as it's coming from a different country or region. From that, they also do what we see a lot of token replay, phishing, right? Phishing is always going to be the organization's top ways threat actors are always going to try to get into the organizations through phishing. And then expose vulnerabilities, right? ADFS, SharePoint, Exchange, anything that's publicly facing, we see all the time, there's always some type of vulnerability that's still publicly facing and not addressed. Another big one we've seen through this was VPN. Some of the VPN misconfigurations, or the threat actor here was actually, they understood the VPN better than probably the customer here, right? They knew exactly what the VPN configuration was and what they're looking for, right? Meaning the checks, right? So we talk about on the HIPS part, right? So does the device meet X, Y, and Z? Okay, we're gonna make our VPS image have X, Y, Z as the setting, and boom, they came right through VPN. There's actually no actual authentication method through that other than some system checks. Anything else on that?
Yeah, additionally on that, what we see is them testing access to the VPN and coming from a plethora of IPs. So different user agents every time, different IP addresses every time, and they traditionally never use the same infrastructure for their initial access and their exploitation. You'll see them pivot around from IPs locally, traditionally located where the user lives, where the user typically accesses the environment from. So using open source, OSINT research to identify where individuals live and try and come from the same areas. And they're also, the really interesting part about the continuous bout is that they already have access to environments and they continue to do the passwords phrase to the same environments. They continue to phish them, they continue to do replay attacks, and instead of just getting access the first time, they're very persistent. And what they do is just identify and collect a bunch of different plethora ways to get in and keep those in their back pockets for later use. And we'll talk to a little bit about the eviction efforts and stuff in a little bit here, and how they use those things that they capture in the entry vectors and the access and use them later. Fairly common for us to see them use an access vector one time, never use it again. We do an eviction effort, and they come back and use it again. And that's traditionally whenever we identify the previous one.
Yeah, so something happened in 2020, and it resulted in a lot of organizations actually weakening their security posture in a number of ways to allow remote work to occur. And it changed the security perimeter for a lot of organizations without the organizations and the security teams really realizing it. A lot of these policies continue to today, and they're great. They move work forward, they allow people to work more effectively, but it's important to take a close look at where that security perimeter is, because actors such as NOBELIUM have begun to notice and exploit those potentially weakened security postures for those areas you're not looking. All sorts of different things. You might put an application on the internet, make it easier to access. Well, if that application is not necessarily patched or the most secure application in the world, it becomes ripe for them to exploit that type of application.
This is some of the persistent mechanisms we've identified with NOBELIUM specifically. We've written blogs on Magic Web and Foggy Web more recently, which is a very novel technique that we'll get into in the next slide of leveraging the GAC and basically bypassing certificate-based authentication. It's a very interesting technique that we've actually only seen one time. Abuse of the Azure applications. So adding of credentials to these applications to never use them, to come back a year later to then access them again. So there's events and alerts that you can see all these things within Azure for the applications, looking for the application registrations with illicit consent grants, or you can look for credentials being added to the applications to be leveraged within whatever permissions that application has. We've seen Azure VPN profiles generated as well twice. Neither time we've seen them actually used though. We'll talk a little bit later about some of the actions that the actor was trying to use with the VPN profiles, but within Azure, it's basically another aspect to get on-prem access. Enumeration and collection of certificates, we're going to beat that to get to death here. There's definitely a lot of certificate hygiene that the global IT world should get better at. And this specific environment that we're talking to here with the image depiction, we're talking about delegated admin privileges here. So cloud service providers had an application or a identity at the root of the cloud service provider that gave them privileged access to their downstream environments. And what we see is trust vectors, time and time again, Nobelium executing and manipulating trust vectors. You want to speak a little bit about some of the cloud service provider stuff we've seen?
Yeah, for sure. So we've seen Nobelium, primarily Nobelium, take a strong run at a lot of cloud solution providers, whether they have access through delegated admin permissions, or they have access via some of the mechanism, direct credentials, VPN, that sort of access, because your service providers often have a lot of access in the environment, maybe not from managed devices or secure devices. So what we've been seeing Nobelium do is exploit those implicit trusts you have with your service provider organizations and follow down this very long chain of trust, the trust chain, to reach their end target. So they might start 3 or 4 degrees removed from who their target is and just follow that along until they get access.
Yeah, definitely. That was definitely a very big and long investigation for us. And then the very last thing on here is we have DC Sykes. So a very sophisticated actor we see coming into environments using very common attack techniques. DC Sykes, LSAS dump, Mimikatz. So they're a very opportunistic attacker, and we see them basically leverage any way to get access into that further down data collection point that they're trying to get to. So access to email, access to your SharePoint servers, where you store your data is really what they're trying to get to, and the means to how they're going to get there are limitless.
So one of the interesting things that Dart saw recently, Nobelium using, they love ADFS. So they developed a backdoor that is explicitly for ADFS that allows them to say they're anyone. And one of the novel techniques here that they're using is they're using this thing where they put the DL in the global assembly cache, and which is something that Dart has honestly never seen before. And the application just loads it. And this is something that I think Austin Baker at Troopers, I think in 2019 kind of talked about as being a potential. But to date, we haven't seen anyone necessarily use it in the wild. At least Dart hasn't. And the way that this backdoor kind of worked, imagine that if you could make a certificate, didn't have to be signed by the intermediate or the root, that just worked. And within each certificate, there's this thing called an extended key usage attribute. That extended key usage attribute, they basically put what we're referring to a magic value in. So you made this magic certificate, you presented it to ADFS, and ADFS just said, yeah, sure, you're good. The certificate's not trusted, but I mean, the function here says that I should issue you claims and put the multiple auth end claim in there. It was one of those things when we were looking at the logs, a lot of things just didn't make any sense. And once we figured out that we saw this common attribute, we were able to kind of craft a certificate to match it, presented it, and we were able to get right on using the same backdoor. So it's just kind of they're very targeted. They're very targeting towards the identity, trying to figure out ways that they can create mistrust within your identity infrastructure so that they can get to their action on objective.
One of the really interesting ways that we were able to identify this, or the key way we were able to identify this, is a customer really understanding their environment, understanding where a user should authenticate from, where they shouldn't authenticate from, understanding what a user should traditionally have access to and what they should and shouldn't do, so baselining per se. And what the customer in this situation was able to identify is anomalous logons. They then started to peel the onion back a little bit, called us in and said, there's some really interesting authentication signals we see here. Can you guys come take a look with us? And that's where we get to the point where we identify magic web. It wasn't easy. It took us about a week.
I think too.
Yeah, quite some time. And we just continuously, we knew the signals. We knew where they were coming from. We knew there was an authentication coming through ADFS. We knew that they were presenting a certificate. We had keyed in exactly on how the authentication flow was occurring, but we weren't sure how it worked. Eventually, we got to the point where we identified the row DLL registered. It was actually registered quite some time before and was never used. Again, with the implants of Nobelium, they're very tactical. They're extremely tight with their tradecraft, meaning they don't do the same thing twice traditionally, even between machine to machine.
So I mentioned before there were some changes made due to COVID-19, March of 2020-ish. One of those big changes that we've seen, and we've seen not only Nobelium exploiting this, but other actors, is the use of various application proxies. Azure Application Proxy, Okta, I think Okta Access, as well as various others, to expose what we would term legacy on-premises applications, whether that be applications that only support Kerberos or LDAP authentication, expose them through and put kind of a modern face on them. So you can use SAML or OAuth or whatever authentication protocol you might want to use, and expose those directly on the internet. Well, what working with customers, we've seen a lot of organizations, like I said before, think I'm putting this IDP firewall in front of it. Well, if an actor is able to steal a token or brute force a password, it doesn't really matter at that point. That application's still effectively on the internet. So an actor could exploit a vulnerable web application, take your pick, drop a web shell on it, and then just operate like they would as if they were in the environment or it was just another application exposed. So just thinking about how where your perimeter is, again, just focusing on the fact that these applications, if they're not patched, it doesn't matter if there's authentication in front of them. All an actor needs at that point is a low level of privilege, a low level privileged account to get to that application.
So back when we look at the cycle, right? One thing we talked about, Johnathan kind of talked about here, was data collection. So part of that data collection, and this is probably one of the most valuable things that we have seen them capture from customers' environment, was password files, right? What does that mean? Admins leaving files on their desktop called Linux passwords, my SharePoint passwords, my admin passwords, right? We can find it, they can find it. Same thing with private certificates, right? We see certificate admins cutting private certificates, leaving that cookie trail along with the private key password in the text file laying on desktop, shared drive, sending it in an email. Well, guess what? They also compromise your email, right? So now they're just siphoning all that data out because now you get your private certificates that were in there. Network architecture diagrams are being sent right through, laying around, right? Things that we think are protected and are vulnerable, or not vulnerable, but important to our infrastructure are kind of just getting thrown around and left on desktops, left on shared drives, emails everywhere. And then part of that, right, is once they get the part of that collection, right, if you went back and you looked at a couple slides back, we talked about how the diagram showed the threat actor coming in with a certificate. Now he's got the certificate, comes back in, now he's got emails, right? Now he's harvesting emails all day long, and we're not even noticing this. And a key thing, and I'll hit on this on the next slide, is how we started identifying a lot of this.
Yeah, Nobelium's like water. Roberto Bam gave me that quote. And basically what they do is they find your cracks. They find a way to go down to the next layer, just like the water does in your bathroom when there's a leak. So leaving this environmental architecture and network diagrams around is an easy way for any actor to identify their next attack vector. We should always store our secrets in something that can be audited, something that can be contained, and something that you can always ensure that access to it is not illicit, that it's definitely the correct user. So migrating to cloud is definitely a good option for that, especially for SharePoint and some of our other secrets.
This is probably one of the most common things we see, right? Certificates, right? In every engagement Dart does, part of our collection of that, we just look for certificates laying around in the environment. And that's probably one of the number one things that's always a given. And what that alludes to, right, is bad admin practices, right? admins are leaving it on their desktop, but they're also surfing to the web, going to their email on, right? They're not cutting these certificates that are code signing certificates, private keys, all that. They're just left on the same system that they're just browsing the web with their normal account. So that's really what comes down to the hygiene level of this. And that's something that at a organizational level you have to really enforce at a policy, but also how do you enforce it through technology? And that's something we can kind of talk about.
Yeah, simple searches for PFX files have really played off for us. And we've really been able to identify actors accessing them as well by knowing where they're stored.
And thinking about where that key material is generated in the first place, one of the great things about certificates is that you can generate the private key on the system that it's going to be used on, never have it leave that system, and just have the CA countersign that request. So oftentimes we'll still see those types of secrets and those certificates passed around. So it's something to really think about as far as your key management process, making sure that you are not transmitting those certificates or those private keys, and you're only transmitting the public keys for to be countersigned. Especially, we've even seen instances where a customer will be using an HSM, which is great, but then they generate the private key material on a completely different system and transmit it to that HSM. So just having some cognizance of how your private key material is generated is very important. It would help out a lot here to prevent the screenshot that you see right now.
And I'd probably say the main certificate here we probably look at for the most is our ADFS token signing certificates, right? That's probably the biggest one that's always going to be leveraged and stolen by these threat actors to use to get back in.
Yeah, because we think about that circle in the middle of it as the identity, and that's really what the threat actor's after. Persistence through identity is the easiest way to lay low. The final aspect of the continuous cycle is the resource development, where we see the actors come in, collect data, collect these network architecture diagrams, understand weak points, leverage those weak points once or twice, go back, develop the next plan for the next attack. This isn't a stagnant actor. They're going to continuously identify another vector, another avenue of approach within your environment to ensure that if you stop one hole, they're going to come through the other way. So it's a key trait we've seen over the last year, going back quite further than that as well. The first bullet point here is NOBELIUM doesn't just go away after being evicted. And we see this continuously when we evict the actor through their known entry vectors and immediately see them come back and attempt to come in over the next day or two. We've also seen them get on pretty decent schedules where they authenticate on Tuesdays and Thursdays through an access vector just to ensure that it's still working. If it doesn't work, we see them go back and test and use that data collection, the resources they've developed to attack the environment again. Certificates are one of the things that we've harped on here as far as accessing the VPNs, and when we put in those blocks to stop the known access vector, we see them go back and relook at their, not see them specifically, but we see them leverage the intelligence gathered to identify another avenue. Expect that NOBELIUM knows your environment better than you. The interesting thing about NOBELIUM that we traditionally always see is they know where your weak points are, and they leverage those weak points time and time again until you fix them. A lot of customers don't even go through and look through their audit reports for their known vulnerabilities. So when you're looking through your Nessus scans and patching, this actor knows where those vulnerabilities are, and they will leverage them and use them. Key identifying them coming through to the same systems is something that we identified pretty recently. We'll talk through a trail of NOBELIUM where we identified them coming through the Azure App Proxy, going to an unpatched server quite a few times, and they actually leverage that to implant backdoors into other areas. And when we close that gap, we see them trying to re-entry the environment using additional resources they've developed, additional credentials they've developed, and just can go all the way down, reaching in their back pocket and pulling out the next card for the next attempt for access. So the last little bit here is we're going to go through the NOBELIUM time machine. We've actually been able to identify NOBELIUM from access, not initial access, but access all the way through the data collection and the continuous cycle. We've been able to identify that a few times, but this one tells a fairly good story.
Yeah, so at the beginning here, we kind of talked about the very beginning of the cycle here, right, was password sprays. So again, we see that happening right here at the initial timeline here. Password sprays ends up being successful. Come in, guess what? They got certificates collected now, right? So now we see the certificate collection taking place. Well, now they found ADFS token signing certificates or any of the ADF certs. So now they've performed the golden SAML attack. So from that, now we see that taking place. So what do? We immediately revoke the ADFS certificates, tap them twice. Now, before we cut over here on this next phase of this, prior to this, like Johnathan said, we didn't know the initial access when it was taking place. The only way we were able to truly identify this, honestly, was through Microsoft Defender for Identity. Once we got Microsoft Defender for Identity out there and we see the authentications taking place, and stacked it with a lot of the other data within the customer's environment, we were able to then, see exactly how the authentications were taking place and then move on to this part of the investigation. And then that's where we kind of see the dotted red line going up and down. That's our, eviction efforts take place at that point, and I'll let Johnathan take over after this part here.
Yeah, so we identified how they were coming in. We knew that they had the token signer certificate because unfortunately it was left in an area not where it shouldn't have been stored. We see them exploiting the golden SAML attacks, and we revoke the certificates. We revoke the certificates and it gets quiet for a few days. We see them attempt to try about 2 and 3 times with the same golden SAML attack and then completely stop. At this point, they knew we were on to them. They come back with an illicit consent grant through a phishing. So they send an email to a user that was unfortunately an administrator that had the ability to register an application. After that, they do additional email harvesting. They use that email harvesting to actually collect credentials from a cloud SPN, and they then perform additional reconnaissance and exfiltration after that. So again, are your secrets safe? Are you passing passwords in emails? Are you storing your passwords on computers, on your desktop? This actor is going to look for those things. After that, we see a VPN entry through certificate. And this was actually how this customer had the VPN configured, through certificate-based authentication. And through the discovery, through the resource development, the actor was able to identify how to come in to look just like the actor by assigning the certificate to the client and authenticating like a normal user every single time with the exact same host name of the user as well. The only thing that keyed us off was the same usage of a user agent string within there.
And I think another thing that keyed us off, actually keyed the customer right off on this, was they're all licensed for Windows 10 Enterprise. Also, they see Windows 10 Pro coming in. That was something they really keyed in on right away. And then when we did the VPN entry with certificates, again, another thing the customer did is they started looking at the performing a software inventory with their Global Protect VPN. So they were doing a software inventory from the system trying to authenticate. And we see NOBELIUM every time changing what software they had installed to see if they could try to match the criteria that was required to come in.
Yeah. After that, we see the SPN used for additional AAD reconnaissance, following that same trend of resource development, data collection, really based around identities. We then see a golden SAML attack again. At this point, we had MDI pushed out fairly good, and we were able to later see a DC sync attack. I'm jumping forward a little bit because at this point, we thought we had them evicted for the most part. We knew that they weren't gone completely, but we didn't really have a signal on where they were coming from. MDI alerted on a DC sync attack, which led us to go back to identify that the actor was actually able to grab the token signer certificate from another desktop after they had rolled it, pass the certificates around, and storing them again in proper places, and the actor just grabbed it again. The user actually had PKI in their title, and we later seen them doing searches for PKI and identified that's how they identified where the user was. They pivoted to the user's machine and were able to grab that certificate from there. So they had multiple entry vectors at this point. They leveraged that other entry vector to grab that token signing certificate to perform a desync attack to grab more identities. At this point, after this, we rolled the token signing certificate again, and this is all in timelines here of when we rolled them, and later we see them pivot to an additional tenant to try and access the same environment through a different vector. And right after this, in the same time of the golden SAML attack on the second tenant, we see some VPN profiles generated, but never actually used. So it just shows that their persistence of what as they're trying to access things, they're not going to stop. And if you don't close your weak points and know your environment, Nobelium will be like water and go through those cracks.
Yeah, I think one thing here to think about, right, we talk about Nobelium. What is their main thing for decades, right? Is espionage, right? Again, against multiple organizations, companies, is espionage. So everything we've seen here was purely from an espionage, right? So what was the main thing we really, I think, was not a game changer for us, but something that we started to keen on a lot more was it was more identity-based attacks, not malware getting dropped. It was all identity through ADFS.
Yeah, increasing your telemetry for authentication signals is a very easy way to identify where Nobelium's going. Looking at where your secrets are stored and seeing who's accessing those is another way to identify them. They're not unbeatable by any means. As you see, we're able to identify complete attack cycles of them. It's just really understanding what their MO is. They're trying to get to your emails, they're trying to get to your secrets, and they're going to use identities laying around as an initial vector to access the environment. Password sprays are definitely something to key in on. Low and slow password sprays traditionally are going to be their method, so that way they don't create any alerts or anything like that, whether your IDP providers, whatever you're using as an identity antivirus or identity EDR. And that's it. We'll be around for questions. If any questions, anybody have any questions?
So there's a little room here if anybody has any questions for the gentleman.
Oh.
So Microsoft, not surprisingly, has a tremendous amount of telemetry. You have a history of supporting customers and clients in the Russian Federation states. I was wondering, you probably not sure if you can answer this or not, but what is Microsoft's current support for existing customer relationships in Russia? And have you aggressively attempted to pursue attribution of, obviously everybody knows it comes from 29 and the SVR, and that attribution is known, but what have you done to build that out using all data sources possible to identify primary and secondary support contractors that support that offensive development and operational ecosystem for that particular military unit?
Yeah, that's a very loaded question that really digs into the threat intelligence aspects of that. Detection and response team DART we're on is purely an incident response team. We do have some Mystic folks that are around. If you want to take that conversation offline, we could definitely speak to that. We'll be available in the booth right through the front. You should see the Microsoft right there. I can get some threat intelligence SMEs with you and discuss through that.
Hey there. So you guys see lots and lots of different customers and different customer environments. What is the one thing that you wish customers would do more consistently? There's 3 of you guys, so you can all give me 3 different answers if you want. But first thing that comes to mind is like the thing you would like to see the most.
Certificate handling. I see a lot of customers mishandle certificates and mishandle secrets. I always go back to, and I think every single time I do a customer outbrief, I'm always saying, yeah, you really need to think about how you're handling and transmitting and moving your certificates. That is the #1 thing that I see, especially with kind of these more complex threat actors, is what they're going after, is focusing on how you are securing the things that are used to authenticate your users and your applications, And it always seems to come back to we mishandled the certificate or we generated the private key off box. Focus on trying to shore that up for sure.
I'll take a step back here since your question was kind of about we work many engagements. So holistically, I would say, and this is my view here, is probably from a security standpoint, the SOCs, right? Most customers are very undermanned in SOCs. They don't have enough personnel. All of a sudden, they miraculously get a budget and everything they wanted for the past 5 years right when the incident happens, right? Never let a good deed go unwasted or a good crisis go to waste. But even then, right, we see a lot of customers that have everything they bought under the sun, but they still don't have personnel who understand the data or how to look at the data, right? It's 10,000 alerts a day, so that's just the normal in our environment, right? So what I see a lot is understaffed SOCs, right, or security personnel, or just understanding how their environment actually works and how it's supposed to flow. And part of that is we see a lot of isolation of, well, the AD team, the Active Directory team's over here, and the server builder team's over here, and the security team's here, but we can't talk to each other, right, because we're security. So none of that happens, right? Who's your best security expert, or your subject matter experts in your own environment, your own people? That's who we rely on when we come and do an investigation, right? And we tell the customers in the day, you should be relying on your AD guys. Your AD people will be the first ones to say, this doesn't look right, because they know it better than anybody else, right? But they're so siloed off that we don't see that happening a lot.
Yeah, I wish customers would get back to brilliance in the basics. Patching your systems and making it hard for an attacker to exploit known vulnerabilities. Outside of nation-state attacks, ransomware groups and low-hanging fruit organizations, crime groups, continuously access environments from rogue systems not patched on the environment. So knowing your environment is so important to understand how to defend it. So really brilliance in the basics to make it harder for the attacker to have to go out and purchase those 0 days to access the environment. So if you make it more difficult for an attacker to hit you with the low-hanging fruit, you can really stop a large amount of attacks. So looking at asset development, what assets are in your environment, and actually taking actions on those. Patching your servers. Even if they're not exposed to the internet doesn't mean they can't be exploited. We still see some of the Exchange vulnerabilities from 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, not patched, and customers think that they can get by not patching. So patching, brilliance in the basics, understanding your environment so you can actually protect it.
Good question, by the way.
Yeah. Awesome. Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time.
All right.